So, today I want to talk about the Republican Party's attempts at voter suppression in response to the 2020 election. Out of all of the 2020 election results, I believe that there's two states that stand out as the most shocking for the Republican Party, namely those of Georgia and Arizona. Now, these two states were historically considered Republican strongholds. On most positions and in most elections, they were voting for the Republican Party. However, in 2020, both Georgia and Arizona voted in two Democrat senators and voted blue in the presidential election. So naturally, the response from the Republican Party to all this is to try to change the rules and stack the deck in their favor. And the way they do this is by using the fear of voter fraud that was perpetuated by the Trump administration, which was already codified racist and had a lot of codified racist connotations, to attempt to pass voter suppression laws through state legislatures. And of course, these voter suppression laws will overwhelmingly affect people of color and poor people. So, with that said, I want to take a look at some of the details in Georgia and then kind of explore a little bit of some of the other legislation across the country that's trying to be passed. So, in Georgia, there is a bill that's going through the state legislature right now called HB 531. Now, HB 531 is an absolute mess. Reading through it is a disaster. I have done it, and it does not read well at all. So the idea around it is that it's supposed to impose restrictions on all forms of voting in Georgia. And of course, whenever we impose restrictions, the impact will be felt most by brown and black voters. This is historically true. Whenever we look back at voter suppression laws, all the way through the US's history, it has been targeted at people of color. And this goes back to the end of the Civil War, where the former slave populations attempting to vote would be met with voter ID laws, with poll taxes, with grandfather clauses that would prevent them access to being able to vote. Loopholes were consistently used to try to suppress votes, and they're done in these ways that are meant to kind of disguise them to look like they are being beneficial or providing some neutral stance, but they're specifically targeting specific groups of people that the party knows will not vote for them. Now, according to a January poll, just under 40% of Georgia voters believe that widespread voter fraud occurred in the last election. Now, again, most of this was put forward by the Trump administration and the Republican Party already, and that 75% of the Republican base in Georgia has this belief that voter fraud was rampant. So the Republican Party is using this and the idea that they want to quell this fear and create a more neutral voting environment in order to create these laws, which again will disproportionately affect people of color and poor people. So we know for a fact that in addition to Georgia, that there's approximately 165 bills that are being put in place across the country to attempt to restrict voter registration and access to voting in the United States. Now, the Georgia bill in particular has some very Georgia-specific components to it. Namely, it's trying to limit who can vote early and who can vote early on Sundays. Now, Sundays in particular are important. The legislation would bar counties from holding voting on the two Sundays that fall within the early 3-week period and only allow it on one Saturday. Currently, counties are required to have locations open on weekdays, plus one Saturday, but they can opt to add more days if they fall within set period, which ends the Friday before an election. So whenever you attempt to vote early in Georgia, the polls are required to be opened for a very specific set of days, namely Monday through Friday and certain Saturdays. However, many areas are allowed to be open on any other days in addition. Now, the new legislature, that piece of legislation rather, that they are trying to pass, the bill, would make it so that Sundays are mandatory off days and that they're only allowed to be open one Saturday. Now, what this does is two things. The first is probably more obvious, that if you only have poll places open between Monday and Friday, that people who work and are part of the working class may not have access to being able to get into the area. And if it's only opened one Saturday, places that do Monday through Friday employment might make it difficult so that everybody has to gather on that one Saturday to actually do their absentee votes, or to do their early voting, rather. The other issue is that there are events in Georgia called Souls to the Polls events, where primarily black churches in large metro areas will have a get out and vote mechanism. So basically, eliminating the Sunday early voting would curtail these and would prevent them from happening. And what essentially happens is, people go to church. A lot of these black communities gather in their churches. They go to church, and afterwards they all go to the early voting location and center and cast their ballots together. And this would, again, specifically target that particular form of voting. And I don't think it's a leap to believe that the Republican Party knows exactly what they're doing by targeting Sundays in this particular way. Now, this bill would actually be the first in Georgia's history to sanction drop boxes in state election board areas. However, it's adding a limitation that again disproportionately affects people who won't have access to reaching it on off hours, by making it so that the drop boxes have to be inside the facilities. So if the facilities are only open Monday through Friday during specific work hours that most people work, that means people who are poor, who are working class, who are people of color are largely going to have a more difficult time accessing these boxes. And so, in addition to all of that, this bill would require that putting ballots in the mail would have to be done by specific times in order to get the ballots to actually arrive by election day. They're not allowing for ballots that arrive after election day to be counted. And so absentee ballots that arrive late or, misplaced in the mail or anything of that sort cannot be addressed. So it prioritizes people who can get out early, but who vote on election day itself, but not necessarily people who have to vote really close to the election. And further making restrictions, HB 531 would require absentee voters to provide their driver's license or state identification numbers on their applications and the oath envelopes that contain the ballot. If a voter does not have this type of identification, however, they must include a photocopy of another form of accepted identification with the application. Now, whenever you create a scenario where you have to have a number or an identification number written on the document, which was not required in the 2020 election, you are adding more boundaries. First and foremost, some people do not have identification. I think it's been showed that overwhelmingly people of color are the populations that do not have IDs in the United States in terms of percentages. And furthermore, I don't know how it breaks down in Georgia in particular, but I imagine that it does follow the national trend. Now, having to have a photocopy of another form of accepted identification can cause a lot of problems. People could scan in the wrong form of identification, somebody could write the wrong number, and it could automatically disqualify a ballot. And if that happens near the end of a voting cycle, then there might not be time to fix it, there might not be websites or proper information available, and that vote might just get thrown out. Mistakes happen. Things happen, and they are counting on those mistakes happening. They are counting on that happening and denying access to people. That is exactly how they hope to stack the deck in their favor, because they want Georgia and Arizona to come back to the Republican position. And this is what I mean when I've said in previous videos that a lot of these locations are essentially occupied territories. It is these policies mixed with the positions of the prison pipeline and so many other aspects of the way that the Republican Party is able to manipulate laws in state legislatures that allow for certain groups of people to be disenfranchised. And when they do this, they allow for only certain voices to be heard. Now, Arizona, again, has a similar issue. And while I'm not going to go into the specifics of Arizona's voter suppression bills, they actually have put forward 19 GOP-backed proposals that would limit or eliminate no-excuse absentee ballots. Now, they control the legislature in Arizona for the state, and this is able to be done through gerrymandering and redlining and so much more of the same practices. And again, this all ties to that idea that the South is occupied territories. Now, it's going to make absentee ballots, impose stricter ID requirements, and even give the legislature the right to pick presidential electors despite election results. There is a shift in the tone where they are making this even more explicit, where essentially they are trying to restrict access and voter turnout. And the thing is also, is the more boundaries you put in place, the more difficult you make it in these situations, the less people who are going to be able to actively, do it. And some people might say, oh, it's too much work, I'm not going to do it. And that's what they're counting on. That's what they actively want, especially from Black voters in their areas. And when you can control the state legislature by controlling which counties have access to things, you can impose these laws which affect the state Senate and House votes, which end up, changing the congressional areas, and it goes all the way up. They are able to, through controlling the districts and the state, the way the state congressional districts are positioned, they can change everything about the state. They can change it from the local level all the way through to the federal level. And that's why in a lot of these areas, it is going to be a requirement in the future that we primary as many candidates, that we put as many Democratic positions that are progressive, specifically progressive, that have more left-leaning policies in place and start to overturn some of these policies that the Republican Party has used. And to further back all of this up, the Brennan Center has posted a number of the restrictive bills, and I just want to highlight a few of them across the country. So there's restrictions on mail-in votings. So for example, lawmakers in Arizona, Georgia, North Dakota, and Oklahoma are trying to seek to eliminate no-excuse absentee voting, making it harder to obtain ballots. So Arizona and Pennsylvania have introduced bills that would eliminate permanent early voter lists. Bills in Arizona, Hawaii, and New Jersey would eliminate permanent absentee voting lists, and Florida would reduce the length of time a voter could remain absentee without having to reapply. So again, the restrictions there is that who is considered an absentee voter is, generally speaking, someone who's wealthier, who might have multiple homes, who might go to another location or run businesses. And this no excuse thing, which was put forward through the pandemic, allowed for certain populations to do absentee voting that would have otherwise denied them. If you're housebound or any other number of reasons, you were able to vote in 2020. And these should be more federally mandated. So again, it's going to disproportionately affect marginalized groups. So you have witness signatures. So 4 states have introduced legislation to make it harder to satisfy existing witness requirements. Arizona's bill would require all mail ballots to be notarized. South Carolina's bill would require a witness to include their driver's license. So yeah, having it notarized means you have to go out and make another step to get your mail-in ballot, taken care of. South Carolina makes it so that not only do you have to have it, but your witness has to have the driver's license. And we've talked about how that can disproportionately affect groups already. 2 Virginia bills would ask that witnesses have to print their name and provide a residential address, which means that people who don't have homes or necessarily have a residential address would be affected. Several other states would further restrict ballot return options. Arizona bill would prohibit mail return, requiring all absentee voters to return their ballots in person. Proposals and lawmakers in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Virginia would prohibit the use of ballot drop boxes. Missouri and New Hampshire would have newly required voters to present identification when returning absentee ballots in person. So it's these little nuanced laws that are being put out there that have the guise of being these fair practices to make sure that fraud isn't happening, that there aren't problems happening. But they end up restricting more and more marginalized groups of people and are attempting to try to change who can have access, who is going to be enfranchised, and who ultimately will have the power in future elections. Because if you can change enough of the people who can vote, you can make it difficult enough so that people of color don't get their voice heard, and the Republican Party will largely end up in power because of that. When you control the game, when you control the board, when you control the rules, you get to dictate whether or not you win or not. And that's exactly what the Republican strategy will be moving forward. So with that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.